The sun rose over the Aegean, gilding marble temples that still smelled of sea salt and sacrifice. From a distance, ancient Greece looked like perfection. White stone, blue water, the cradle of philosophy and beauty. But beneath the polished columns, another world pulsed, a hidden city of flesh and desire, where gods watched men sin and men blamed the gods for wanting. To the Greeks, the body was not shame. It was a temple, a battlefield, and a theater. Love was a craft, lust, a language, pleasure, a prayer whispered to gods, who answered in silence. In Athens, desire was not secret. It was sculpted in marble, painted on pottery, carved into myth. Zeus transformed into a swan for seduction. Aphrodite rose from foam, not as purity, but as promise. Even Apollo, god of light, carried shadows on his lips. Yet within this worship of beauty lay darkness. For every song of love, there was a ritual of power, acts that blurred the line between reverence and cruelty. The Greeks believed pleasure was divine, but only for those strong enough to command it. The rest, the slaves, the women, the children, were not partners in ecstasy, but instruments of it. In the symposium halls, wine flowed until thought dissolved. Men reclined on couches draped in silk, their hands heavy with rings, their words with philosophy. They debated virtue, while servants filled their cups, and flutes played in the corner. But as night deepened, the air thickened, and philosophy gave way to performance. Behind closed doors, beneath frescoes of heroes and gods, desire became theater. The symposium was more than a feast. It was a stage for dominance. To an outsider, these gatherings were elegance incarnate, candles flickering against polished bronze, laughter soft as honey, but the laughter often hid screams. Beneath the laughter, bodies became trophies, proof of wealth, proof of power. In those dimly lit rooms, love was measured not in tenderness, but in control. Even marriage, that cornerstone of civilization, was less about affection and more about legacy. Wives were chosen not for love, but for lineage, a womb for heirs, a keeper of the hearth. Men sought pleasure elsewhere, in courtesans, in servants, in the same-sex companionships they called higher love. To the philosophers, such bonds were noble, a union of intellect and spirit. But reality was often harsher. The young were taught to obey first and feel later. In Sparta, boys of 12 were paired with older soldiers, not as equals, but as apprentices in both war and desire. It was said to build loyalty, to turn flesh into brotherhood, and perhaps it did. But it also blurred innocence into submission, a ritualized surrender, disguised as education. The city that worshipped discipline used passion as its forge. Elsewhere, sacred temples hid their own contradictions. Priests of Aphrodite claimed their bodies as offerings. Worshippers came not to pray, but to touch. Coins clinked, candles burned, and the goddess watched, neither blessing nor condemning. For the Greeks, the divine did not demand purity. It demanded participation. Even myths carried their hungers openly. When Zeus descended upon mortals in disguise, as bull, as swan, as golden rain, he blurred consent into cosmic will. Mortals called it destiny. Victims called it fate. and poets called it beauty. It was art built from violation, a culture that carved its sins into marble and called them eternal. Still, not all was cruelty. To some, these rituals were liberation, a defiance of the unknown, a celebration of mortality. Where others saw shame, the Greeks saw truth. That desire, like fire, could both create and destroy. And so they danced with it, painted it, studied it, worshipped it, until the dance became doctrine. But behind the myths and murals, one truth lingered like smoke over the sea. The Greeks did not fear sin. They feared insignificance. To be forgotten was worse than to be condemned. And so, every act, no matter how strange or sacred, was done in pursuit of immortality. Through flesh, they sought eternity. Through pleasure, they defied death. As the night fell over Athens, the Parthenon gleamed against the stars. Inside its shadow, laughter rose from a villa, sweet at first, then slurred, then sharp. A song drifted through the air, a hymn to Dionysus, god of ecstasy and madness. And somewhere in the city's dark heart, another ritual began. The drums quickened, the wine spilled, the bodies moved in rhythm, older than law, older than reason. And in that moment, the city that birthed philosophy surrendered again to the one truth it could never outthink, that beneath the marble and the reason, every man is still flesh, every god still hungry, and every civilization built on the edge between reverence and ruin. Twilight settles over the Aegean again. In the half-light, the temples lose their innocence. Marble that once seemed pure now gleams like skin. Statues of gods shimmer with a knowing smile. The line between worship and indulgence vanishes with the sun. The Greeks believed desire was a language the divine could understand. To touch was to pray. To yield was to honor the gods who made mortals in their own passions. But what began as reverence slowly turned into ritual, a choreography of ecstasy that blurred the borders between heaven and the flesh. In Corinth, high above the city, stood the temple of Aphrodite. Its priests and priestesses were said to embody the goddess herself. Each night, they descended into the city streets, perfumed and veiled, offering what they called hieros gamos, the sacred union. Men paid coin not for sin, but for salvation. To lie with a priestess was to borrow divinity for a moment, to taste the goddess in mortal form. For some, it was holiness. For others, heresy wrapped in silk. The temple's fires never died. Drums thudded softly beneath the mountain wind, and the scent of myrrh drifted across the rooftops. Inside, bodies moved with ritual precision. Steps older than language, gestures borrowed from myth. It was worship by surrender, belief through breath. No one left unchanged. Yet not all rituals sought pleasure. Some sought power. In the shadowed shrines of Dionysus, god of wine and madness, worshippers drank until identity dissolved. Men wore ivy crowns. Women tore their garments, their eyes glazed in frenzy. The Maenads, his chosen devotees, danced until exhaustion broke into revelation. They claimed to feel the pulse of the god himself in their veins. But when the trance ended, the aftermath was often blood. Animals, or sometimes men, were torn apart in ecstatic sacrifice. In Dionysus's name, Reason was drowned so the divine could surface. To the Greeks, balance was everything. They spoke of moderation, sophrosin, the wisdom of restraint. But restraint is fragile against the weight of belief. Each festival began with wine and ended with confession. Each act of reverence walked hand in hand with indulgence. They sought order through chaos, purity through corruption, salvation through sin. Even the philosophers could not resist the pull. Plato wrote of love as a ladder climbing toward truth. The first rung was the body, the highest, the soul, but few ever climbed beyond the flesh. For every treatise on virtue, there was a symposium drenched in excess. For every statue of Apollo, there was a hidden fresco showing what even poets dared not speak aloud. And then came the theater, the mirror of the city. On its stage, the Athenians confessed everything they would not admit in daylight. Masked actors moaned, mocked, and moralized. Comedies by Aristophanes turned vice into laughter, dressing scandal in rhythm and rhyme. When audiences laughed, they cleansed themselves of guilt. Public sin became public therapy. But not all laughter heals. Behind the jokes lingered a deeper truth. The body was never private. To be seen was to exist. To be desired was to live forever. That hunger for remembrance infected every brushstroke, every carved muscle of marble. A statue was not just art. It was defiance against time, and desire was the sculptor's weapon. The gymnasiums, those open courtyards where men trained, were temples of flesh. Bodies glistened with oil, moving in rhythm like living statues. Spectators gathered not only to admire skill, but to adore perfection. For the Greeks, beauty was moral currency. To be beautiful was to be good. To be desired was to be divine. And so, competition and seduction merged until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. The festivals of Eros, held each spring, blurred the city's laws. Strangers met beneath torchlight, exchanging wreaths of roses and promises never meant to last. Married, single, noble, or slave, it did not matter. Under the eyes of the love god, all were equal, if only for a night. The next morning, the city swept its streets and pretended it had never happened. But memory lingered in whispers, in the blush on faces at dawn. Not every tale survived in marble. Some lived only in rumor. A queen who bathed in milk mixed with the tears of her lovers. A poet who carved odes on the skin of his muse. A philosopher who argued that pleasure was proof of the soul's existence. Each story blurred the sacred and the profane, each one a confession. The world refused to forget. In their pursuit of beauty, the Greeks touched something vast, something that could elevate or destroy. They believed that every act of desire, no matter how strange, was a dialogue with eternity. If gods could love as wildly as men, then perhaps man was godlike after all. But beneath the marble and the poetry, the same truth whispered through every century. What begins as worship can end as indulgence, and every civilization that dances too long with ecstasy must one day face the silence that follows. As the night deepened over Corinth, the fires on the temple hill flickered and dimmed. Somewhere below, the last hymn to Aphrodite faded into the wind. The priests gathered the ashes, the dancers slept among the petals, and the sea kept its secrets. Only the statues remained awake, eyes of stone staring into eternity, remembering everything humanity tried to forget. Night fell again over the marble cities of Greece, but this time, shadows carried memory. The echo of laughter from the symposiums still clung to the stones. The smell of incense drifted from temples that never slept. To live in Greece was to live beneath the eyes of gods who judged and desired in equal measure. They had built a civilization that adored beauty, and in doing so, they made obsession a virtue. In the heart of Athens, where the Parthenon cast its long shadow, the lines between reverence and indulgence blurred further. Philosophers taught moderation, yet even they could not escape the allure of the forbidden. They called it paideia, the education of the soul, but the lessons often began with the body. Older men courted youth, not out of hunger, they said, but to kindle virtue. They spoke of mentorship, enlightenment, the sharing of wisdom. But in the private courtyards, where their lectures ended, the truth became harder to defend. Desire dressed itself in philosophy, and no one dared to name it by its true name. The Greeks were masters of masks. In their theaters, in their rituals, even in their marriages, everyone played a role. A man could speak of chastity in daylight and drink with his courtesan by night. A wife could pray to Hera for fidelity, while envying Aphrodite's freedom. Society itself became a performance. Every citizen, both actor and audience, in the grand play of desire. And behind every mask, the same face stared back, human, hungry, and afraid of the silence that follows satisfaction. In the poorer quarters, the line between sacred and profane vanished completely. Courtesans, known as hetairai, lived lives of paradox, slaves in name, yet queens in influence. They could not marry, but they dined with philosophers and kings. Men confessed to them more honestly than to their wives, because pleasure was the only language that made truth possible. Some hetairai were educated, even revered. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was said to have shaped the thoughts of Athens itself, yet even she was judged for the same thing that made her powerful, the audacity to own her desire. For every hetera who lived in luxury, hundreds of nameless women survived in the shadows. In the brothels near the docks, they worked by candlelight until dawn. Sailors came with coins and left with ghosts. No hymns were sung for them. No poems carved their names into stone. But they were the real chorus of Greece, the silent rhythm beneath the marble, and the myth. And what of the men? They, too, were prisoners of expectation. To show tenderness was weakness. To conquer was divine. The soldier who wept was mocked. The lover who knelt was damned. And so they learned to love like warriors, briefly, fiercely, and without peace. Desire was not shared. It was taken. Each act of love carried the echo of a battlefield. In the rituals of Artemis, women bathed in the river before marriage, offering their innocence to the goddess. But those who refused to wed, who sought freedom instead of family, were branded cursed. Parthenoi, the perpetual virgins. Their purity was admired, but their independence feared. Even in worship, a woman's choice was a rebellion. The myths that surrounded them told of punishment for passion. Medusa, once beautiful, turned to a monster for the sin of being desired. Phaedra burned with forbidden longing and was destroyed by it. Every tale warned that the price of wanting was ruin, and yet the Greeks could not stop wanting. They built temples to gods who punished them, and still returned to kneel before those altars. By the 2nd century, the empire had begun to rot from within. The theaters still filled, but the laughter had changed. It was hollow now, a nervous echo of something once pure. The old ideals of beauty and virtue were fading, replaced by appetite and spectacle. In Corinth's streets, imported luxuries glittered beside poverty. Perfume from Egypt, silk from Persia, spices from far Asia, all sold beside bodies priced by the hour. Even the temples had become markets where salvation could be bought for a coin. Yet beneath the corruption, something eternal endured. The Greeks had taught the world that beauty could be truth, and truth could be terrible. They had built art from longing, philosophy from lust, and myth from guilt. They had turned shame into sculpture, and sin into scripture. And though centuries would pass, though empires would rise and fall, humanity would never forget the lesson they carved in marble, that the body is both the temple and the curse within it. At sunset, the sea glowed like fire. A solitary statue of Aphrodite stood on the shore, her marble face eroded by salt and time. She had watched the rise and fall of men who claimed to worship her, kings, poets, priests. Now the waves kissed her feet as if asking forgiveness. But stone does not forgive. It only remembers. Some say that at night, when the wind howls through the ruins, you can still hear the faint murmur of laughter, of hymns, of pleas. The ghosts of a people who worshipped desire and were consumed by it. In that sound, the gods and mortals still meet, in love, in lust, in ruin, for the Greeks had given the world not perfection, but a mirror, and in that mirror, humanity still finds itself trembling between ecstasy and regret. Centuries passed, and the marble cracked. Empires rose, oceans shifted, languages changed. But the stories of Greece remained, carved in stone, whispered through the dust of fallen columns. To the world, it became a legend, a place where gods once walked among mortals, where wisdom was born from passion and sin was dressed as philosophy. But legends have a way of hiding their wounds beneath beauty. Archaeologists would one day uncover the remnants of those temples, fragments of statues, shattered pottery, faded frescoes of dancers and lovers. The colors still clung to the clay, faint but defiant, like memories refusing to die. What they found shocked them. The gods of Greece had not been worshipped in purity, but in paradox. The sacred and the profane had always shared the same altar. Among the ruins of Corinth, they unearthed small terracotta figurines, lovers entwined, their faces erased by time. Some scholars called them votive offerings, gifts to Aphrodite for fertility. Others whispered they were souvenirs of the flesh, tokens bought after ritual encounters. Either way, they were fragments of truth, evidence that the Greeks did not separate the holy from the human. To them, pleasure was not sin, it was remembrance. But remembrance has a price. For centuries, poets and philosophers wrestled with what Greece left behind. Christian Rome, rising from its ashes, called it decadence, the fall of reason to lust. the corruption of civilization by its own appetite. The same statues, once praised as divine, were now draped in cloth, their beauty deemed dangerous. The temples were torn down, the gods silenced, and desire was recast as guilt. Yet even guilt could not kill the echo. The art survived, the words survived, the idea survived. That beauty, love, and sin are merely reflections of the same flame. Each age that condemned Greece also secretly envied it, because within those ruins lies the truth every empire fears, that the human heart worships not order, but longing. At the height of their power, the Greeks had looked upon themselves and said, "We are gods in waiting." They sculpted perfection because they believed perfection could be reached. But when a man believes himself divine, he forgets the boundaries that protect him from his own hunger. So the same hands that built temples also destroyed them, chasing a vision no mortal could sustain. In time, the myths turned into mirrors. Zeus, who could not resist his desires, became a warning. Aphrodite, born of the sea's foam, became the symbol of the cost of beauty. Even Dionysus, the god of wine and chaos, became a lesson in what happens when freedom devours restraint. The Greeks had written their confessions in marble, and the world would spend millennia reading them, trying not to see itself in the reflection. But what of those left behind? The courtesans, the priests, the nameless lovers whose bodies once carried the prayers of a civilization. Where did they go? Time swallowed them, but their silence lingers in every broken amphora, every chipped statue. The stone remembers what history tries to forget. At Delphi, the oracle once whispered that knowledge begins with knowing oneself, but the Greeks proved that to truly know oneself is to face what lies beneath the mask. They faced it, and in doing so, they built eternity from shame and beauty alike. Centuries later, travelers still stand before the ruins and feel a strange ache, not for power, but for passion. They run their fingers along the smooth marble, tracing the curves that once belonged to gods, and feel warmth where there should be only cold. It is the warmth of memory, of recognition, because every civilization carries a piece of Greece within it. The hunger to create, to love, to defy, and to fall. At sunset, the ruins glow as if alive. Wind moves through the broken pillars, sounding almost like breath, and if one listens long enough, they can hear it, a murmur beneath the wind, faint and haunting, the whisper of the old world calling to the new. It does not speak of conquest or philosophy. It speaks of flesh, of longing, of the truth every age must learn and relearn, that beauty cannot exist without hunger, and hunger cannot live without consequence. The Greeks knew this. They wrote it in every statue, every poem, every secret carved into their temples. They left behind not just history, but a question that no one has yet answered. How can the same hands that reach for the divine also destroy what they love most? As the stars rise over the Aegean once more, the sea reflects their cold fire. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the voices of the past drift like prayers. They are not begging for forgiveness. They are simply telling their story. The story of a people who dared to worship beauty in all its forms and paid the price of immortality. And when you stand there, among the ruins, listening to the night, you may feel it too, that ancient heartbeat pulsing beneath the earth. It is not history. It is not myth. It is something older, something human. It is desire remembering itself.